Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the Community Speaker Series. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the data-driven Carroll journey. I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves in just a moment, but just a little preview of what we're going to talk about tonight, some exciting topics. What is data? How do educators at Carroll access data? And how do we use this to inform curriculum and groupings? How do we think about longitudinal data, and how do we use that longitudinal data to help our secondary school advising team support families in making the right decision for next schools? And finally, we'll finish off with a little bit about research. The topics that we've chosen tonight are a compilation of a lot of very commonly asked questions by families, those who are prospective, kind of thinking about Carroll, those who are current Carroll families. So we're delighted to be hitting a lot of these high points. Just a little housekeeping. As we do not use the chat in these discussions. We do have the Q&A button. So if you have questions during the presentation, please throw them in there. It's possible that we'll answer them in the context of things we've already prepared, or we can kind of braid them into some of the things that we're talking about. And we're eager to engage with you. And then our very last slide has a little contact information should you think of something later and want to send us a little email and ask a question. So it's my pleasure this evening I'll kick it off to you, Jen. You're the first one on my screen, to my colleagues if they want to introduce themselves.
Good evening. Thanks, Stacy. Good evening, everybody. I'm excited to see you, imagine you behind the screen here today. I am Jen Brock. I am the head of product here at Carroll.
It's great to join you guys tonight. We are excited to talk to you guys about data. My name is Ben Shepard. I am our TCI curriculum coordinator, so I oversee a lot of our cognitive interventions that have a huge impact on our data culture and really support a lot of data conversations across all three divisions.
And hi, everyone. My name is Louisa French. I have worn many hats here at Carroll, but tonight I am coming to you wearing my educational analyst hat. So I work with Ben and Jen, and I spend my days doing all things data for Carroll and Carroll students.
Thanks so much, everyone. And on the back end, as always, we have Amy Dempster, our Director of Communications and Marketing. So just to kind of kick us off tonight, it's probably important for us to define what is data, just to set the stage.
Yeah, and I'll kick us off with this one, Stacy. I'm so glad we are starting with this question because I think that our definition of data at Carroll is really expansive. I'll say when I first came to the data world at Carroll, I thought that data was just the numbers. I was thinking about charts and graphs and Excel spreadsheets. And don't get me wrong, I get to do all sorts of fun for me, work with those tools all day long. But data at Carroll is about so much more than just the numbers. And so I'll break that down into some specifics for us. But when I think about data at Carroll, I think about it falling into four broad categories. So the first category that I start with is what I call external data. And I think of this as data that is happening outside of the four walls of Carroll School, outside of the school day. And we start here because the biggest influx of this external data is the admissions process. So for anyone on this video who has participated in the admissions process, or maybe who is currently participating in the admissions process, you know exactly how much data we're talking about. It is an enormous amount of data. And this data obviously is very helpful through that admissions process. But what I want to underscore is that it doesn't stop there. All of this work that you all have put into providing us with information about your students, we refer to this data throughout the student's journey at Carroll. It's key to those first few weeks and months when maybe we don't know as much about your student yet, but it also serves as this really important baseline that we can refer back to and understand, okay, how much progress has this student really made since they started here? The other thing about external data, which is important, is that yes, the admissions process is probably the biggest influx of this data, but this external data is coming in throughout a student's time at Carroll. It might be in the form of a formal evaluation, but it also might be coming in the form of those informal conversations that are making up that school home partnership. So we take all of that information and we add it to our data repository and our understanding of students. The next category of data, which I sort of juxtapose against that external data, is the academic data. And that's, if the external data is happening outside of the four walls of Carroll School, this academic data is what's going on inside of our school buildings during the school day. And so you can see on the right here some examples of the kinds of academic data that is coming up for our students throughout the school year, but it really covers all aspects of our curriculum. And traditionally, we're updating these measures at least 3 times a year. Okay, the next one is a big one. And I'm so glad that it shows up at the bottom of this visual, because this is actually, I think, the foundation of our data approach at Carroll. And this is the qualitative data. This is things that aren't really captured in the numbers. And what I think is so important to underscore here is that later on, when we're showing examples of data, you might not see this qualitative data in the chart or in the data table, but it is there and it is foundational to our approach. Whenever we talk about contextualizing or interpreting data at Carroll, we're starting here. We're starting with that qualitative information. So even if you can't see it, it is there and it is informing everything we do. And then, of course, as a member of the cognitive team, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight all of the amazing data that comes in through our TCI program. So for every student who is participating in targeted cognitive intervention at Carroll, we get cognitive assessments at least twice a year that really complement the rest of these data. But we're also getting day-to-day updates on their progress through TCI that can help us understand what's going on in TCI, but also how students are approaching skill development throughout their classes. So that's, yeah, go ahead, Stacey.
You're kind of making me think about the TCI platform and as a repository for all our data. Like we're sort of like the idea here is like, where do we hold all this?
And that's a great question. So I'm going to actually pass that off to Jen, because she can speak to how we use the TCI platform to make data accessible to teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And there's a few different elements we'll talk about. And I'm so glad that we're starting with why on earth are we talking about TCI in the context of this? I am sure that most of you, if you haven't attended one of our webinars on TCI, or if you haven't had any exposure to it yet, there's some great sessions that are recorded that you can reference. But why are we talking about the TCI platform in the context of all of this? In order for us to run our targeted cognitive intervention program, we are relying on all of this data about our students to help us understand what's actually happening from a cognitive processing perspective in their brains, so that we can then be assigning the right programs with the right interventions to work on that. In order to do that, as luck has it, we have to bring all of this data together in one place. So rather than data sitting in filing cabinets or in binders or folders, we've brought this all together into a data repository. And you can really think of the TCI platform as this data hub. It's a hub not only for us to store the data, but also for all of our teachers to be able to access the data and interact with that data. And when we're thinking about this data, and you're going to have a chance to see a number of different visualization examples as we go through this, we're not simply talking about like a table with some data points on it. There is so much rich information we have across all of these different data sources. We have, in some instances, tens to hundreds of discrete data points that are rolling up into broader elements. And so we think about categories and we think about domain level scores. And then if we're tutors, we start to really dig into, for example, where we might be seeing errors on a particular assessment. So each one of these, as we look at them, you can imagine this constellation of data sitting behind each and every one of the data points that you're seeing on that chart in front of you. We're able to, by bringing all of this data together in a structured environment, we're able to make it accessible. And by accessible, I don't just mean teachers can log on and look at it. We're able to bring it together in ways that make sense and bring the data to life to inform what's actually happening when your children are trying to process information. Um, it's really complicated, but we like to think that the work that we put in makes it really easy for teachers to look at it and then inform how they're going to approach each student's journey at Carroll, starting at when they enroll until they're graduating and leaving us onto their next academic adventure. Um, Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we teach teachers how to use this data?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. First, one of the things I do want to follow up with what you were just talking about, Jen, is really that access piece. I know you downplayed it a little bit, but I remember the days of the file cabinet and the logjam of having to, if you're doing a file read and trying to learn about the kids that you have in front of you, sometimes that neuropsych isn't in that file. Sometimes it was already checked out. And the way that we use our data electronically really eliminates that. So it means that the access to it is much more widespread and much more usable. And obviously, those visualization things are key to help us understand it all and put it all together. But in terms of the training that we do at Carroll, we have dedicated time for our teachers throughout the year to work on data and different kind of time points where the data usage becomes a little bit heavier. One of those, for example, is at the start of the year. All of our teachers have, like we were saying, have access to that admissions data, that wealth of knowledge in the neuropsych, the academic data, the cognitive data, and so they can start to understand the students that they have in front of them. And so in our opening meetings, before kids even get here, we are working with teachers and training them on the tools that we've developed to interpret it and to help them get a leg up and hit the ground running when they start the year with their students. At Carroll, data is a foundational piece of our diagnostic prescriptive framework for Orton-Gillingham. It runs through all the things that we do, really. It helps us individualize for each student, figure out where the specific strengths and weaknesses are, strengths to leverage, weaknesses to support and remediate. And the process of doing that is iterative and keeps going on throughout the year. One of those touch points, I'm going to kind of go bottom up here a little bit, is during our parent-teacher conferences. Particularly, we have a data-heavy one that comes around March, but actually throughout all of our conferences, we are using data in the background to inform the discussions that we're having and the information that we're communicating. For instance, in the November conference, we're looking at initial data, so our baseline data for students and where they came in on, and developing goals and actionable steps that we're taking and communicating of how we're going to address those needs moving forward. At the end of the year, you'll often see some work samples comparing a beginning of the year writing sample to an end of the year writing sample. And even though those aren't quantitative data, the comparison of those and the progress you can see if you've ever written an essay and gotten better at it and iterated it, you can see it in the reading, in the vocab. There are so many factors that that kind of bring that to life. Another area where we are explicitly using data and supporting our data culture is in our coaching conversations. Now, coaching conversations at Carroll take place between a teacher and their coach, so their mentor. And this is a one-on-one space where they can talk about what things are working, what new strategies to try to help contextualize some of the data and profiles and address the needs of the students in that classroom. All of our divisions engage in student profile work and understanding. We do it in a developmentally appropriate way that really focuses on the needs of those specific grade levels. So for instance, grades our BRs through 4s are self-contained models. So the teacher's teaching all of the same group in different subjects. And in a model like that, you don't necessarily need to have a whole team together to discuss all of the ins and outs. And so those teachers engage more in a file read to understand their group. We've also developed some amazing reports, thank you, Louisa, that show an entire classroom's data or grouping data all at once, so that teachers can understand a group of kids and the needs of what that specific group will take to make them successful. Our team meetings are areas where your students' teaching teams all come together and use data diagnostically to identify areas of need and prescribe actionable plans to support them. Each division has different levers and mechanisms for reiterating this process if things aren't working, because once you make that action plan, the data culture doesn't stop. We have to circle back. We have to see if what we're doing is successful. And if it's not, we need to come up with a new plan. And each division has its own mechanisms for having those conversations. All of those conversations are grounded in student profiles, identifying strengths that we can leverage, and identifying gaps that we need to support. The foundation of them, and often the instigator for these conversations, are teacher observations. It's the things teachers are seeing in the classroom. And this space is such a collaborative space that gives teachers the opportunity to bounce ideas off each other and see how kids are performing in one subject versus another. And the things that we can learn from there are really fascinating to me as kind of a data nerd and as a little bit of the research hat. Sometimes we'll see that a kid struggles with the classes that are really language intensive. So your language focus area or your ELA class. Other times it's the bigger group sizes, and there's a social dynamic piece there that's causing a student to have trouble. And you only really get that when you bring a team together and are able to have these conversations around a student profile, how they're presenting, and finally, they're always action oriented. We always come out of them with a plan of action to move forward, whether that is a homework planner that can help them get independent work done at home, or an engagement tracker to track a student's participation between classes. And so we're always coming out with some tools and some steps to take to engage a student and build that success.
Ben, can I ask you a question? We had a kind of parent question come in around, they love all the data, thank you so much. And is this cognitive data or data in general, we can extrapolate just a little bit there. How can this be shared with parents? I mean, we have our conferences and so forth, but can you speak more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a number of times when we really need to be able to share our data in a usable, digestible way externally. And one of the great things about the TCI platform that we've developed in this data repository is we have some reports that do just that, that are easily accessible to us and a student's advisor that have a lot of context in there, a lot of descriptions of what the tests are, and are the tool that we use to communicate those outside of our walls.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I guess, so we've been sort of speaking about the data, we've defined it, we've talked about how we're training teachers to use it. So how do we take this next stage, and how does data guide curriculum?
I am gonna take this one on, Stacy, and I'm actually gonna return to a former era and give a personal example from my time as a science teacher. Because, as some of you might have noticed, there are no science assessments on the list of data that we shared. And so you might be thinking, well, it probably doesn't really help the science teacher. And actually, data was so crucial to my approach in science. Really starting from those action plans that were generated in team meetings or in my coaching meetings that Ben spoke to, that was the baseline, sort of understanding who was in my classroom and how we might meet the individual needs of each student, whether they're academic, whether they're social, whether there's a study skill need, really building together that complete picture. But then this is where it got fun. There was so much information coming out of some of the other academic areas that would inform my work in science. So if any of you have ever taken a science class, by the time you hit middle school, high school, pretty much every science vocabulary word is going to be a Latin or Greek root with a prefix and a suffix. So I was able to draw really closely off of what work was going on in OG tutorials to understand how to bring in that morphology learning and make it applicable in science. On the ELA side, we did a lot of writing in science. And I know you hear all about the writing process in ELA. And I was leaning so heavily on my ELA colleagues to understand where are students in the writing process, where are their strengths that we can leverage, and where are there maybe some areas that we can give them a little extra practice in science so they can start to see that this skill applies everywhere and not just in an ELA class. And then, of course, there is the math side. I've heard it said that math is the language of science. And anytime we were doing math in science, I was drawing really carefully from what I understood of my students' math skills, both in the sense, there were some students that had really strong math skills that we could really leverage. But also, if there was a skill gap, I needed to be really cognizant of that as a science teacher to make sure I was providing the scaffolding and the support so that every student in the room could engage with the content. And I want to be really clear, I'm telling a personal example here because I'm familiar with it, but I didn't come up with this approach. I learned this from my coaches, from my colleagues at Carroll. It was in the water, it was everywhere around me. And I was able to sort of build this data-informed skill set by working with my colleagues and my mentors at Carroll. So it's everywhere. It's not just in my classroom. And it was really wonderful to see how it would all play out in different places.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we also talk a lot at Carroll about how we use data and in the information sessions, if for any of you who are still kind of involved and you've perhaps watched some of our Blue People where we sort of talk about how we micro segment around many 26 to 36 different variables to create these really homogeneous groupings to maximize the learning. How do we use this data to group the students and then measure the progress?
So I'll start with the grouping piece, and I think Ben will turn to you to talk more about the monitoring progress. But Ben kind of alluded to this about how we have at our disposal with our data hub the ability to make these data reports that provide educators with a view of lots of students all at once. You can see sort of where the strengths, where the needs are, and see groups of students together. And so, I heard an interesting stat recently that Iram, our lower school language department head, when she's thinking through language groupings in the lower school, she's bringing together somewhere on the order of 25 to 35 variables for every single student. And so we help out by providing Iram with a lot of that information. And then what Iram and other folks who are making these groupings do is they sort of weed through that and they find, okay, where are there maybe a couple of students that would fit really well together for a small focus area or OG grouping? Where are there students that have some of the same skills, same needs? But what's really cool, I think, about this approach at Carroll is I think it's really agile and it's very developmentally appropriate and also academic area specific. So just because folks in the ELA or the tutoring side might be looking at these variables that I'm showing here for an OG pair, the math folks are going to be pulling from an entirely different set of variables that really speak to students' math skills. And they might pull out a different group of students and a few other students that are not shown here that fit together for a really productive and engaging math class. So this approach, it's really individualized. It is so nuanced. The folks that are working on this are really thinking through every little piece of a student's profile, their academic skills, their social emotional needs, their study skills, their time at Carroll, how they've done in previous years, and really individualizing the approach until they come up with these really targeted groups. And, just because a group makes sense for ELA doesn't mean it makes sense for math. And so they scramble it up and start over for the next class, which is, I think, part of what really drives so much of our student success. So over to you, Ben, to talk about the progress monitoring. So after these groups are made, then what?
Yeah, so after these groups are made, we want to monitor our students' progress, and we want to make sure that we are improving their reading skills and hitting the goals that we've set for them. To do that, we have to kind of move away from looking at individual data points to comparing multiple data points, so growth over time. So what we're looking at here is reading fluency data that's comparing a fall round of testing to a spring round of testing. And comparing the time points of in terms of the change in words correct per minute, but also looking at it in terms of some of the component skills that build up to it, like accuracy, as well as the normative measures like a percentile ranking or a standard score. So what does progress look like? Progress looks like in this specific chart, it's green. Progress looks like you're gaining those correct words per minute in the case of reading fluency. Our goal with our students is to always close the gap, and that's where we really tune into the normative data. We look at our percentile ranks, we look at our standard scores, so those middle two columns. If those columns were a 0, it would mean that the percentile rank didn't change. So if you started in the 10th percentile, you're still in the 10th percentile. That really means that you're making year-to-year growth as expected as compared to your peers nationally. So whenever this number is higher than 0, that means that we're closing the gap and you are making more than expected progress compared to your nationally normed peers. Now, not everybody makes the same level of progress. And sometimes that happens because there are skill gaps in our students' profiles. Some of these students are struggling with their accuracy. Their pace is increasing, but the accuracy is becoming more of an issue that we need to focus on. One thing that we know about reading fluency, and I think we'll touch on it a bit later too, but you need to be about 98% accurate in order to comprehend what you're reading. And so we are always looking at the skills that kind of build up to a skill like reading fluency. Now, reading fluency we sometimes think of as more, instead of like an outcome or a cause of a learning struggle, sometimes I like to think about it as a symptom. And with that, we have to figure out what is causing that symptom. And often there are skill gaps in students' profiles. These could be academic. These could be some of the foundational Orton-Gillingham levels. These could be other things. There could be some social emotional things going on that are causing the progress not to be quite as expected. There could be some speech and language things going on that we need to have some additional support. And we are so fortunate here at Carroll to have an amazing crew of counselors and speech and language pathologists that we can lean on for additional supports. Sometimes those supports are push-in supports. Sometimes those are scheduled check-ins with a counselor. Sometimes those supports are consultations on lesson plans and feedback. Sometimes we don't have all the answers, though, in-house. And one of the things that I love about Carroll so much is the community, both in terms of our immediate community, our parents, our students, our teachers, but also our broader community, our research community. We are very lucky to be in an area of the country that has a lot of expert people on reading. And I want to tell a story about a specific student that was in our upper school program and who was a puzzle to all of us. We had so many of the meetings I was talking about. We tried so many different strategies to engage this student, but their reading was not budging. Our cognitive measures were showing growth, we're showing proficient skills, but this student reported seeing the letters on the page spinning around physically. So we reached out to some of our collaborators, some friends of Carroll in the community, to help us figure out what was going on. As it turns out, this particular student actually added to the wealth of research knowledge in terms of how we process visual information, because this was a profile that the leading experts in the country on visual processing had never seen before. And while that could be a little bit discouraging in some cases, what was amazing about this collaboration was the impact that this student, who was an amazing student, amazing athlete, but so stuck on the reading components, was able to have such an impact broadly on the research. I think that was very empowering for them. At the same time, they also developed a specific font for this student that allowed the student to ground the images that they were seeing and be able to decode words and read. And so this collaboration was such a fruitful thing to do, because we're adding to the research knowledge, we're getting tools to support a student, and we're really building this sense of community and collaboration across many fields and spaces.
Ben, I remember the student you're talking about, and I'm thinking it's such a great example of like the Give Every Child piece, and it was a little bit before AI, and I recall people transcribing text into this specific font for this student. What I also love about this story is it demonstrates we're contributing to the research, but very real time making adjustments to this student's curriculum that help them to advance even while we're advancing kind of the larger field. It's amazing. One question that came in as you were speaking was about do groupings change, sort of during the year in response to progress monitoring?
Should I take that
You want
one,
to you
Stacy,
want to go,
since
Louisa?
I
Sure.
was speaking about the
Anyone?
grouping? So I think the goal with this grouping process, and the reason we spend so much time and take it so seriously, is that we hope to get it right on the first try. We want to create these learning communities where students get to spend the year learning with the same group of students. We know how much that sense of belonging and that sense of being in peers that understand you, how much that can empower students' success. And so whenever possible, we really try to get it right on the first try. But we don't always get it right. Maybe it's because there was something that we didn't know about that we learned throughout the year, or maybe it's because the student's progress really surprises us. And so we are able to be really agile when we feel like there's a place that a student might be a better fit than where they are currently. But I think of that as being sort of something that we do on special cases, but more often than not, I think our educators and our academic leaders are pretty good, and they get it right almost all the time. And I think that's really powerful for our students because, even in the largest classes, our educators are so good at making these like really tight-knit communities, and students, I think, really benefit from spending the whole year learning with the same group of peers. And there's still lots of opportunities to mix it up because, like I said, it changes with each subject once students get older and out of that sort of self-contained model. And then, of course, there's things like the multis groupings that are maybe going to be entirely different than the academic grouping. So for students who that social piece is really important, there are opportunities to learn with not just the same group of students all year long.
And I'll add one piece to that too. I think one of the things that the progress monitoring helps us do in terms of those groupings is modify our instruction and how we're presenting information to really meet the needs of students. If the needs of that group change, we like Louisa said are really agile and able to provide either some push and support, some additional resources. And sometimes it takes changing up in approach and learning some new skills and approaches to teaching that information. So I think a lot of times we focus the progress monitoring on tweaks that can happen kind of from the teacher side.
I think we also feel the burden of we need to be making more than a year's worth of progress every year. We need to close the gap. So we have very different pressures from traditional learning environments. Ben, you alluded to kind of early, in some of the things you said about what if progress is slower than expected?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna let Louisa start this one off, but I will say that for me, even though on the surface, when it doesn't look like a student is making progress, there's often signals underneath buried that we can identify. And when data doesn't match up and doesn't make sense, I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a way to start generating some questions and starting to get some answers, and bringing some more resources to bear to help us figure that out. So I see it a little bit as an opportunity to learn how to best support those students when the data isn't going up to the right every single time.
I think it's Allison West who says that the data helps us ask really good questions. And that's what I think of here. But yeah, to Ben's point, I think one of the things that having all of this huge data repository and the ability to study data over time, not just for one student, but for groups of students, allows us to say really confidently that progress is not always linear. You know, it's not an exception when that progress is kind of a little bit unexpected. It's actually normal to see ups and downs. So what I've got here is a reading fluency graph. And if you focused in on just that dip, you might be like, oh my goodness, why has the student just backtracked and lost so much progress? But what we can say when we zoom out and look longitudinally, first of all, we can say, well, actually, overall, the progress is really phenomenal. That, they're really steadily progressing towards that goal. I've got that 120 words per minute highlighted because that's what we know from research is sort of the threshold where students are comprehending. So yeah, there was a dip, but the overall progress is trending towards that goal. But the other thing that we can do by sort of zooming out and looking at this data holistically is we can look at things like the norms. And so that's these kind of lighter colored lines behind our students' dark black line. And we see that actually the norms also show these dips, right? And we know that these dips correspond to the students entered a new grade, and all of a sudden the text has gotten a lot harder than what they're used to. And so their first exposure to that text, they're probably going to read slower than they did the prior spring when they were reading a text that was much easier for them. So, we have this ability to kind of zoom out and look at the progress holistically. And, we're not going to panic. We're going to look and see, is there something expected going on here that we can actually sort of put into context and help explain using the data? But the other thing that I think often is going on, and Ben, you sort of alluded to this, is there may be sort of other skills that are factoring in and where we might be seeing progress or indicators of progress, but it's not necessarily showing up yet in that sort of more high level measure. And so again, in the case of reading fluency, we know a huge component to that fluency is the accuracy piece, right? We know that the point of reading fluently is so that you can comprehend what you're reading. And as Ben said earlier, if you're reading less than 98% accuracy, it's really hard to comprehend what you're reading. And so in the case of that student who maybe their progress was bouncing around a little bit in terms of the rate, could also be that student was really focusing in on accuracy for the first several years of their time at Carroll, and that they really needed to solidify that foundational skill before they could start to work on rate. And actually, they may have been coached in their reading work as they're practicing reading fluency to slow down and decode the words accurately. And that you might see that show up in the reading rate as, the progress isn't coming as quickly as we might hope. But actually, that's because the student is really digging in on that accuracy. And once the accuracy is solid, then we're going to see the rate start to improve too. So, two things here. One is really zooming out to understand the broader context. And the second is, are there other indicators of progress that maybe don't show up when you look at just one data point?
I'm not going to bury the lead. The answer is yes. There are other things that come into play. So the student we're just looking at is a student who is struggling with reading fluency. And the image you're looking here, we call a radar chart. And this is really a snapshot in time for a student. It gives all the different measures that we collect in our system in one place that's digestible and is that you can visualize. To give you some context, the bigger the wedge, the stronger the skill. Not all these measures are apples to apples. Some are normative, some are mastery levels. But suffice it to say that as those wedges move out towards the edge of the radar, that skill is growing. But for this particular student, we can see that the reading fluency is a major area of concern and something that we want to move. But the other things that we notice when we look at a student's whole profile are that this student is still working on some levels of their OG curriculum. Working through levels 1 and 2 is a really crucial marker for students to start to gain reading rate and accuracy. If you can decode the vast majority of the words in English, you start to become more automatic as you recognize them visually and are able to do it quicker. The other piece of the puzzle that we really focus in on is cognitive skills. We know that students with dyslexia are really smart, full stop, but they do have gaps in their cognitive profile, particularly in areas of processing speed and working memory, so cognitive efficiency. So you have these really smart kids that are super thinkers, but the efficiency of how they can process information doesn't keep up with the level of insight or problem solving that they're able to achieve in other sorts of tasks. And so we take a look at cognitive skills really closely, not only because it's part of our department's role here, but because of the impact that it plays instructionally across a student's day. A student with processing speed weaknesses often needs more wait time from a teacher to generate an answer. A student that struggles with verbal working memory skills needs more visuals to take in information. And so instructionally, this data is really a guide for us on how best to support kids throughout their day. And also in our domain, in the TCI domain, it gives us a marker and a guide on what we need to intervene on and what we need to remediate. If we can start to build these skills, we actually start to see a radiant effect from these students. And as they get stronger, you'll notice that that reading fluency is starting to move. But it didn't happen at first. The learning doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it takes multiple years. Sometimes for us to solidify a cognitive profile, it takes multiple rounds of TCI. One year they might be focused on reaction time. Another year it might be more of an accuracy intervention or a working memory intervention. And so the iterations that we do in terms of our approach and the program that we design for students is crucial to seeing that longitudinal growth over time. Now, there's one thing I want to talk about because I think this is actually a new thing that we're able to visualize that I'm really excited to share with our community. And it's how we think about and contextualize variability in data. One data point is great, particularly if it's representative of a student's overall performance. If that skill isn't variable, it might look something like this. You know, a fairly consistent performance from the student on a measure of executive functioning. We're looking, those dotted lines in there are mark kind of the average zone under a normative distribution, so the bell curve. And this student is extraordinarily consistent and strong at this executive function or shifting attention task. But that's not always the case. Some students on certain measures are highly variable. There's peaks and valleys to the profile. And this can be really informative in a number of ways for us as educators. On the very surface level, what it helps us understand is on a student's best day, what can we expect from them? On their worst day, what can we expect from them? And on average, what can we expect from them? And so it gives us a range of abilities to be able to plan and adapt for when we can understand if a student has some highly variable tendencies. This can also help guide us in terms of identifying some underlying weaknesses or some other kind of confounding variables. While these quantitative measures are not used as a way to identify or diagnose things like attention or anxiety. This type of variability is highly indicative of some struggles in those domains. In attention, if you can't focus on the task at hand, or your attention drifts from your computer screen in this processing speed measure, you're not going to get through as many responses, or you might not be as accurate, and your performance is going to drop. And if you have, for a student that might have some test taking anxiety, one thing that the research consistently shows about social emotional regulation and working memory is that physically those two skills and cognitive abilities are competing for the same resources in your brain. They literally get processed in the same area. And so when you're anxious or stressed out, you physically and literally don't have the same amount of resources to engage with the task at hand, and your performance drops. And so this type of variability can help us generate some really important questions that we often use to communicate with the teaching team. But also, these are indicators for us to follow up with other members of our team. And you may not know it yet if you're a prospective parent. If you are a current parent, you are a crucial part to our data team. We can't do all of the things in the what, 8 hours, 7 hours that we have the students on campus. The work doesn't end there, and students present with the same struggles at home as they do at school. Sometimes they put a better face on at school even, and it all can come out at home. But to that end, it is so important for us at Carroll to engage with parents in a collaborative work, because we're all part of the same team working towards the same goals. Often what we'll do is if we are seeing some of these data trends or some concerns have been brought up in a team meeting, that's a cue for an advisor to reach out, start communicating some of those struggles that we're seeing. We will often talk about some of the strategies that we're using in-house. In some cases, we suggest getting some additional assessments, whether it's a speech and language assessment, or whether there are some other outside supports that could be really helpful to engage with outside of school that we can also bring into school and keep that kind of consistent approach here and at home as well. So welcome to the data team.
Welcome to the data team. I had a comment and a question. So Ben, I remember learning something very interesting from you, and I was thinking about looking at that last slide about the variability and the processing speed. And I remember you saying to me one time, you could perform worse than you should, but you can never perform better than you can. So it's important that we always be looking at these peaks and then understanding the variability in the dips. And I thought that was really fascinating. Like, you can't be better than you can be, right? So it's important for us to look at the top level. And kind of related to the top level, a parent asked a really insightful question, which is something we practice all the time, is how do we lever the strengths of our students? We've been focusing on kind of deficits and weaknesses, but how do we lever strengths in mobilizing progress?
Oh my gosh, that is so core
I
to
know we
our
need a
our
whole webinar.
approach.
I know.
I love the question. I love that the insight towards it, because we have to leverage strengths in order to get at some of the weaknesses. Whether it's balancing a preferred task with an unpreferred task, maybe as a reward. Maybe there are other ways that those sort of things are hugely impactful.
I can chime in a little bit too
Yep.
here, Ben, because I'm thinking about how the data hub gives our educators access to the full picture. And I think I hear so often from folks, it's often folks in like the tutorial department where they spend all of their time working with students in the student's hardest class. They are drilling in on the skills that this student is just so struggling with. And they find it so empowering to get to see where maybe there is a really incredible strength in a math skill or in a cognitive skill. And I think it helps to kind of contextualize where for them when maybe they don't get to see the student demonstrate that skill as readily in their class. But then they can also say, okay, I know that this is something that you're really skilled at, you're really confident in. And so we're going to do a whole OG lesson about, what you're working on in makers. because that's going to get that buy-in, and it's going to make you feel like you have a lot of confidence in something to contribute in this lesson, even though we're working on a decoding skill that you are not confident in, and that's really hard for you. And so I think having that visibility into the whole picture is really helpful for all of our educators, but especially those educators that spend so much time just deep in that learning pit in the struggle with our students.
Yeah, and the other thing I think that is so important about the strength perception perspective is that's where we start all of these discussions with our with our teachers about students. We talk about the strengths. We talk about what is working, and often the action plans that we come up with for students involve the strengths. We were just in a team meeting earlier today, in fact, and we have a student who loves to draw. But is struggling a bit with some regulation and being present and ready to learn. And teachers all agreed that drawing in the context of the class could be an amazing tool to help him settle and regulate and be available for learning.
I think we also talk about this in the sort of construct of the day, which is that there's several blocks a day that are kind of dedicated to traditional dyslexic advantages, that we can only do hard things for so long. And we need to have places where we feel things come naturally to us and we feel organically good about what we're doing. And then that kind of confidence spillover effect that we talk about. Um, Before we move on to talking about longitudinal data, I had a parent question around accessing these radar charts or how they might be able to see these.
I can chime in here. So um, first things first, current parents can expect a data report at the end of every school year. That's just sort of standard practice, and we always do that. After school year wraps, that'll be in Aspen. But the other thing is that your student's advisor is really your first contact point. They too are part of the data team, even though maybe they don't know it yet. So if there is some information that you want to see, I would suggest first reaching out to them, and they've got our numbers. They know how to get in touch with us, and if there's data that we can provide them with, we're happy to help with that. But for everyone, an end of year data report is coming your way in just a few short weeks. And then if there's more information you're looking for, we suggest by starting with the advisor, and they'll make sure to get you in touch with the right people.
Thank you so much. So kind of now moving our attention to looking at how does Carroll use longitudinal data? And then we've got one more topic coming up after this. Please, people, hang on with us which is about how the secondary school advising team uses data. So we're going to take you a little bit here and then move the trajectory for Carroll and beyond.
Yeah, I'll start out with this one. I think I'm going to talk about the kind of individual longitudinal progress, but I'm going to hand it off to you, Louisa, to talk about kind of the higher level, group level data. Longitudinal progress is really what we want. We want to see progress over time. And while this radar that we're looking at on the left is a great snapshot in time, like I was saying, it is only that, a snapshot in time. The most recent data point for all of these different measures is displayed. So seeing growth and progress over time, while we can animate nicely in PowerPoint, it's hard to do in a PDF report. And so often these radar charts are used as just that, a snapshot, but it doesn't give us the whole story. We really need to look at progress over time so that we can track the markers that we're really trying to move. What we're looking at is on the right here is a line graph of track my progress. And this student, had some struggles in year 2 and with a big dip. And for us, what we want to look at is why did that happen? And so one of the variables that come in super handy for a number of reasons is how much time did this student spend on this test? And weird, the effort and the time that the student was putting into the test resulted in better performance. When they rushed through it and spent 10 minutes on it or a little over 10 minutes on it, they didn't do so well. So when you rush, you don't do things as carefully, and you make more errors. And this is a tool that we use to have conversations with our students, and visualize this type of relationship, the effort that they put in, the time they spend on a task, and how that translates into their performance. Um, and this, I think, illustrates the learning pit, that we talk about so frequently, about the process of learning a new skill and building a new skill, and the ebbs and flows that that takes. I was watching a presentation recently, and this professor described the process of learning in terms of emotions, and the emotion that everyone came up with is learning is frustrating, learning is hard, because your overall goal is mastery and knowing the thing. But when you start, you don't necessarily have all that. And the process of learning and struggling and failing and picking yourself back up can be painful and it can hurt. But it is such a crucial part of the learning process, because digging yourself out of that pit and having success brings you to the other side. This helps us really also, understand where our kids are in that learning process, what types of supports we need to bring to bear, whether we need to have a data meeting with the student and talk about the student's profile to bring some awareness there, or whether it's a student that might need, the student might need a quieter space with less distractions, or a counselor check-in before a test to kind of solidify or to ease some anxieties around that. And so looking from a longitudinal perspective can really show us some of these factors that really add up to success for each student. It also gives us an opportunity to look at trends over time and understand a particular student's ebb and flow within a school year. Some kids start slow in the fall. When they come back to us, they need to get back into that routine, and their progress doesn't really pick up until to the point where we would like to see it until the winter. Some kids come in, you know, raring to go, right out of the starting blocks, and are making a lot of progress immediately. But then winter gets hard, the cold, dark days of winter that we're finally out of now. Could be tough for that student, and everyone has a different ebb and flow to how they react to the school year. But it can really help us identify those times, and also give suggestions on how to support that better, whether that's with some summertime Orton Gillingham work to stave off some of that dip in work in reading fluency that we see over the summer for everybody nationally, or whether that's bringing some other resources to bear.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna jump in here really quickly to talk about academic outcomes more broadly. Tonight we've really been focused in on our approach where we give each child what they most need. But we do on the data team get to every once in a while step back and look at how our students as a group are doing over the entirety of their time at Carroll. For folks who were able to attend some of the parent visitor days, you might have seen some data that looked a little bit like this, but this is just a look at the progress students made in math track by progress from the last couple of graduating classes. And what I really want to highlight here is how that how that growth trajectory changes from when they started with us back in 3rd grade all the way up to when they left us as 8th graders, and how really it was a long game for these students, that it took years of hard work. And I think the other thing that's really phenomenal when we see these longitudinal data is we can see the consistency over time. So each of these lines that I'm going to pop up here are an individual graduating class, and the dark blue is the average of everybody. And there's some variation from grade to grade. We expect that. We know that each group of students is a little bit different, but there's also a phenomenal amount of consistency among our Carroll students year to year. And our students make a lot of progress over their time here at Carroll. And then really quickly, I'm just going to jump to the ELA side. Same idea, same students. And again, that Carroll dark blue line, when we think from 3rd grade all the way to 8th grade, some phenomenal progress in ELA. So going back to those strengths that question asked about, Stacy, I think this is one of those places too where we get to think about that, because something that maybe wasn't a strength when students first joined us over and over again in the data, we see so much progress, and we can really capitalize on that growth for every student, which is really, really one of my favorite parts of the work we get to do on the data team.
Because we're running just a little bit short on time, I'm just going to say, once upon a time, I was a member of the secondary school advising team, and how much we used all of this Carroll data, right? So how does this inform the process? Can we do this in like 2 minutes? And then also there's a question that we have, which someone could answer simultaneously, is how aware are our Carroll students of this data collection process? I mean, do they just feel like they're being assessed all the time? Help us understand this better.
Absolutely. Well, let me jump in and talk briefly about the secondary school advising side of things. So just like our teaching teams are using all of this data, if we go back to the very beginning of this presentation, we talked about how we're using all of this data to get to know your children when they're first coming to Carroll and informing those teaching teams every year. Our secondary school advising team is doing the exact same thing with this data. As the team is getting to know you and your child based on that family or the parent questionnaire that you're submitting, kicking off that secondary school advising process in the spring of 7th grade, they're starting to look at this data too. And part of what this allows them to do is start to identify what's going to be needed when your child leaves Carroll, right? You're going to have your goals for your child's going to have their goals of what they want, but we want to be looking at things like, are we going to need a high school that has more comprehensive support, whether more aligned with what Carroll does, whether it's integrated or moderate support where there may be some supports in place, whether we're going to be in a minimal support setting, as well as supporting that IEP and 504 process as students are leaving. So just like our teaching teams are using this to to know your kids as they're coming here, our secondary school advising team does the exact same thing to help them land in the exact right place as they're leaving here. Hope I did that justice in like 30 seconds.
I could jump in to answer the question about if students are aware about our data collection process. The short answer is yes. Our kids are smart. They know what's going on. When you have them do the same thing a couple times a year, they start to catch on in what's happening. I don't think it always sinks in until we're able to have those conversations and show them all of the data, though. We really try to structure those conversations in a developmentally appropriate way, and we really find that it is, we talk about strengths and struggles in the lower school, but really starting around 6th grade is where we start having explicit discussions and showing students these data reports to really bring some awareness to their profile. And I think that does two things. I think it helps name the struggle that they're having, particularly as they're emerging as adolescents, in searching for their identity and all of those pieces. Knowing the strengths and weaknesses explicitly and seeing it and visualizing it is so important and impactful. But it also gives a little bit of accountability for these measures too. When students know that you're looking at it and checking in on the data, they tend to put a little bit more effort into it. And so we always try to have those feedback loops with students as well. But that's also something that we're continuing to build out and figure out the best way to do that for everybody.
Thank you so much. Any final comments from any of our panelists before we say goodnight? Anything on your mind? All right, thank you.
I do want to flash up, Stacy, really quickly some contact info. I think this could also speak to the question of how do I get access to this data? If we didn't answer your question tonight, or if you think of one later that you didn't ask during this time, please send us an email. One of us will get back to you, and we'll keep the conversation going. We love talking about data. We could do another hour if we had it.
And thank you to those of you in the audience who asked really insightful questions. We thought we had it covered, and then these really great questions always come. So thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you to Jen, Ben, and Louisa. We really appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Good night.